you very much. There we go. It's just told me it's been recorded. Thank you very much, Louise. Hopefully, I just want to double check that PowerPoint is showing through. Can I have a thumbs up from someone if it is? Perfect, brilliant. So welcome everyone to listen to me and Joe ramble. I will ramble not so eloquently, while I'm sure Joe will ramble more eloquently than me about the MARGE model of learning, which is an idea from Arthur Shimamura. I'm really excited to talk about this in terms of the book. There's a picture of it over there, and here it is as well. It's out on Monday. I'm really excited to talk about this idea of how there's this wider view of the learning process that we can consider that starts from how we engage with pupils and motivate them through the process of learning, and goes all the way through to how we evaluate how they know what we think they know, and how they can evaluate what they think they know as well. So I'm Nimish. I'm Curriculum Research Lead at the Creative Education Trust and Vice Principal at Wren School in Wellingborough. Joe Jukes is also presenting today, is Curriculum Research Lead at the Education Alliance. Please do ask us questions about us on Twitter if you want to engage with us more about it. So to start off with, we need to know what MARGE actually is and what each of the letters stand for. So it's an acronym, and it talks about the process of learning. It's a whole brain approach. And when we talk about things as a whole brain approach, people think about left brain, right brain, and some of the ideas that revolve around that. And off the bat, I just want to say that's not what MARGE is about. MARGE is about neuroscience and cognitive science and how the two can come together to affect our classroom practice. So the letters of MARGE, M stands for motivate, and motivating ourselves to action, getting ourselves to that point where we're actually trying to get students engaged with the learning process and excited about the process of learning. Attend, so A is for attend to the relevant facts and information that is actually being delivered to students. So what is it actually about what we're delivering that we want them to pay attention to? So the ideas of motivation and attention have been real key areas that I know the education sector is looking into in detail right now. So it's lovely to be able to write a book and present about the ideas of motivation and attention. The R stands for relate. So lots of things have been said about relating information, relating new information to what we already know, the idea of how retrieval practice can help with that, the idea of how schematic representations can help with that. That's something that we've really discussed in detail before on previous periods, but also on Twitter as well. So relate is a key part of this. Generate, so how we can actually, G for generate, where we can actually generate new learning and improve our memory. We're trying to link different ideas together. So when we're talking about ideas and discussing them in detail and going through the process of elaboration, how can we actually understand more about what we're discussing and therefore improve our memory? And evaluate, so how can we evaluate our proficiency in learning and really check how well we think we know something? So as I work throughout this presentation, we'll be going through these key areas over here. So let's start with this idea of a whole brain approach to learning. So as with most models of learning, we discuss in detail what learning actually means. So Shimamura in his paper goes through the idea of what he believes learning is. And he talks about the idea of learning being our ability to acquire knowledge from sensory experiences. So it's this whole idea of different types of learning that can take place. So that's perceptual learning, conceptual learning, skill learning. And what he discusses in detail is what we do as teachers, which is conceptual learning, understanding a concept, delivering a concept from ourselves, from our own knowledge base to that of the students. Now, when he talks about which model of this is useful, when he talks about which direction we should be going with this, he talks about the idea of top-down and bottom-up processing. Bottom-up processing is when we're talking about the idea of information just being absorbed, almost as if by diffusion. So we're just putting it out there and students are just absorbing this knowledge, and then they're processing it and categorizing it with what they already know. Now, the problem with that is how are we guiding that process? We're just assuming that when we put the information out there into the ether, that students are going to be able to absorb it and literally attach it to the right bits of information they actually have. So top-down processing, he says, is much more efficient and it's much more explicit in terms of making those links between what is known and what is being delivered. So it's that whole idea of using prior knowledge to guide sensory information and therefore make explicit links between that new knowledge that's being delivered and the old knowledge which is known. So he links this model of top-down processing to his understanding of the brain. So Shimamura was a neuroscientist, and I used the word was, because unfortunately he passed away last year. So he was a neuroscientist who had a deep understanding of cognitive science. So through the process of MRI, through the process of magnetic resonance imaging, he scanned the brain as part of the process of trying to understand how people learn. Now, while this doesn't have huge classroom implications, what it does is it provides the evidence base for the rest of the MARGE model. So we looked at the certain areas of the brain and their place within the learning process. We looked at areas like the prefrontal cortex, the optical cortex, the hemisphere gyrus, the medial temporal lobe, the cerebral cortex, the midbrain, and how each of those were involved in how we actually learn. So I was really lucky that Sarah Jones, when she got an early copy of the book, made a couple of slides for me that will be available and shared afterwards, that go through the process of how the brain is linked to certain parts of MARGE. Now, while this is each part of the brain is quite discretely linked to areas of MARGE, to motivate, to attend, to relate, to generate, to evaluate, it's not as straightforward as that. And that's why we're talking about this as a whole brain learning process, whole brain model of learning. So when we talk about the idea of the midbrain, we link this to the idea of motivate. That contains that reward circuit within the brain. That's where dopamine is produced, which you might have heard about, which is part of this whole idea of motivation. It links motivation to memory. The prefrontal cortex, and a great way to think about the prefrontal cortex is a bit like a conductor in an orchestra, literally directing the attention and saying what bit of information needs to be drawn out from our memory, what bit of information we're paying attention to, and how those things are linking together. So the prefrontal cortex plays a huge job within controlling executive functions, really directing the learning that's taking place. So sound information, that comes in through the hemisphere gyrus. Optical cortex, that's where sight information comes in. So those two things link to the prefrontal cortex, and therefore the prefrontal cortex can actually direct what are we actually looking at and what are we actually listening to. So all of that information comes in. What are we listening to? What part of that are we actually paying very close attention to? What are we looking at? What part of that are we paying really close attention to? So if we take this back to that whole idea of a top-down learning process, a top-down process for learning, what we really need to consider is actually how does what we know affect what we're looking at and what we're listening to. There's the medial temporal lobe. So that's where information is bound into episodic memory. That's where the whole idea of relating information takes place. And the cerebral cortex, which is where the location of conceptual memory stores. So when we're actually trying to generate new ideas, that's where that takes place. And that's almost like a sheet around the outside of the brain. And finally, we go back to the area of evaluating. That goes back to the idea of the prefrontal cortex, paying really close attention to key areas and directing what we're actually paying attention to so that we can evaluate to what we know. So it's not always as simple as motivate is to do with reward pathways and attend is to do with prefrontal cortex, etc., etc., etc. But the idea is that each of these play key roles in each of those processes. So that's just a short introduction to the brain. And when Shimamura got this understanding of the brain, he really started to zoom in on three key ideas. And these three ideas come up throughout the book, and they drive the process of attend, relate, and generate. And that is the idea of compare, contrast, and categorize. So those three ideas, the three C's as he calls them, come up quite often throughout his paper and throughout the book. How do we compare things? How do we contrast things? And how do we put things into categories? And how can that drive what we pay attention to? How we relate to knowledge together? And how we can generate to new knowledge and therefore improve our memory. So we've gone through the idea of a whole brain approach to learning. We've talked about a definition of learning that we have from Shimamura's MARGE model, what top-down processing is, what bottom-up processing is, and what the three C's are as well. So let's get into motivate. Let's get into what the M stands for. So motivating ourselves to action. Shimamura says that the trick with motivation is to expand what actually causes us to have pleasure-seeking experiences as part of the learning process. So how do we push ourselves into new learning situations? So the idea of big picture questions, the process of storytelling, the idea of asking aesthetic questions, and the process of exploring new places and new ideas are some of the ideas that is mentioned before, talk to, or link to the idea of motivating us to want to learn more within our academic journey. So let's go through each of these in detail, talking about what they actually look like in action. So, big picture questions. So what actually are they? That's why we're asking questions that are engaging, that cover large areas of knowledge. So we're not talking about real small explicit questions here, we're talking about wide questions that cover large areas of the curriculum. And the idea with this is this gives students a bigger picture about what they're trying to learn about. And by doing that, they're more motivated to want to learn more. So an idea could be that in PE, we could ask the question, what affects an elite sports person's performance? And that could motivate students to want to learn more about areas such as nutrition and psychology. So it's by having that really wide, big question, we can motivate students to want to learn more about a specific area, but also areas that are attached to that as well. Shimamura also talks about the power of storytelling, not only within our explanations, but also within our curriculum design. And when we engage with the narratives that are within our subject, we can really harness what we're doing there. So the idea of cause and effect within storytelling is something that he talks about quite often within what we can do with our explanations and what we can do with our curriculum. The idea is that conflict is something that quite often comes up in storytelling, is again something that we can discuss when it comes to the idea of trying to harness storytelling within our delivery. So in business, when we're talking about marketing and product development cycles, the whole idea of this conflict between Apple and Samsung can be used to tell stories about competing organizations and how they've gone through what they've gone through in terms of product development. The key with using the process of storytelling is we can leave students at a point where they're wanting to know more, and that's what motivation is about. The really interesting part about motivation that I got to when I was reading through Shimamura's paper, and it came when he started to talk about storytelling, was we're not talking about the process of nudging norms or rewarding students for performance. We're talking about motivating students through the process of them wanting to learn more about a subject by knowing bits in the first place. I'm really lucky that I had an excellent case study provided to me by Joanne Crofts, who's on the call today, about this area of asking aesthetic questions. And aesthetic questions really get to that point of asking emotional questions about how students feel about specific concepts. So in English, we can ask these type of aesthetic questions to get students to think deeply about characters within a novel, and therefore develop a deeper understanding about the techniques that are being used there, and that motivates them to form more thoughtful opinions. Another example could be in science, where we could ask aesthetic questions around the idea of ethics, and therefore we're getting students to consider the wider implications about the knowledge they're actually learning. And by making students engage with aesthetic questions, we're actually motivating them to want to learn more because we're making it personal for them. They're allowed to almost share their own feelings about what they think about a specific topic. We can also use this idea of exploring new places and new ideas. So if we engage with our culturally rich environment, we can start to get to this point of actually expanding a range of pleasure-seeking experiences that a student actually has. So in terms of languages, we could motivate students to learn more about a specific language or more about a specific area within language by exposing them to a culture. That could be through pictures or books or films. So it's a really interesting way of thinking about how we can motivate our students. And when we put certain videos on in lessons, we need to think, well, how actually is this motivating our students to want to learn more about the topic that I'm teaching them right now? And when we talk about ideas like the hinterland within our curriculum, I think it's really important to consider how are we expanding that range of pleasure-seeking activities that we actually have. So that's motivate, talking about the idea of big picture questions, harnessing storytelling, aesthetic questions, exploring new ideas and new places. And that takes us to the end of what we mean by motivate. When we move on to attend, we're talking about relating facts and information, and we're actually paying attention to relevant facts and information. So let's break that down. What Shimamura is talking about is the fact that attention takes effort. It's an active process that actually needs us to actually focus on an area and be aware of what we're actually needing to pay attention to. So this is not a passive process. And when he talks about learning as being a top-down process, we need to actually use what we know to guide what we're trying to find out about. So it's active rather than passive. So in terms of directing students' attention, it talks about the idea of explicit learning goals, the ideas of chunking, using the 3 C's, so compare, contrast, and categorize, and this whole idea of taking a guided tour. So attend. Attend, the first bit he talks about is explicit learning goals. So this is where we make it very, very specific what we're actually asking students to pay attention to and be able to do by the end of the lesson. By doing this, students have almost like an explicit set of success criteria that they're trying to achieve by the end of a certain lesson, or the end of a sequence of lessons, or by the end of a teaching or the delivery of a concept. So by breaking down those big picture questions that we're using to motivate students, we can really get them to pay attention to really clear, small things. And therefore, they're guided through the process of learning. So if we've got a big question, such as what is the aim of a music video and how is it represented in the example provided, say in media, we could actually start to talk about, well, how do music videos, including the example provided, promote sales, or how do they promote new artists, or how do they promote the image of the artist? So by breaking it down, we're saying, well, actually, this is how we use a music video, but these are all the things that we could use it for. Making it explicit what you're wanting them to pay attention to allows them to clearly categorize what they're learning about. And that ties in with the 3 C's that we'll talk about in a second. So chunking, Shimamura talks about the idea of chunking being about grouping together meaningful units, which make it easier for a student to actually take that knowledge in. And it makes perfect sense. If we're trying to ask students to pay attention to things, by breaking things down into small chunks, it's easier for them to actually take that information. If the chunks are too wide, it becomes incredibly difficult for them to take that information in. So one of the examples that he wrote about within the paper, or referenced within the paper in some of the articles that he wrote online, was about art. Shimamura, while being a scientist, had a deep love of art as well, and he talked about art quite often. And a lot of his ideas around the learning process also related to the learning process in an artistic manner as well as in a scientific manner. So one of his articles referenced the idea that when we're talking about art, chunking is actually a really important thing to consider in art instruction. And actually, where we're talking about certain techniques that are often used in portrait painting, we need to chunk those together separately compared to those that are used in still life painting. What that leads to is this whole idea of being able to categorize knowledge for students. So they know that right now I'm paying attention to what I'm doing within portrait painting. And then after that, I'm going to be talking about still life painting. And here we come to the 3 C's: compare, contrast, and categorize. So Shimamura talked a lot about how we can use the 3 C's to really drive attention. And actually, when you first come across an idea, how do you use the 3 C's to direct exactly what you want students to be paying attention to? So in RE, we could categorize and compare religions or religious beliefs or of different faiths based on geographical origins. So we talk about the fact that Hinduism and Buddhism are very similar because they've come potentially from similar parts of the world, geographical origins, or they have similar thoughts on the afterlife. So by doing this idea of categorizing different religions or different ideas, what we can actually start to do is to understand exactly why they are similar by directing students' attention to specific categories and specific areas. This was one of the things that really drew me into Shimamura's paper, the idea of taking a guided tour. So what he suggests is that the idea of a tour guide leading students through the curriculum is something that we should be considering as teachers, and how it's really important that we focus their attention on key pieces of knowledge and start to make the links between them as we're delivering it. And if we think about what a tour guide does when they take somebody around a tour in a city on holiday, that's exactly what they're doing. They're directing the tour party's attention to key bits, key sites, key historical facts that are interesting, engaging, but they're directing their attention to certain things. And this really came when I read this paper when I actually went down to Harry Potter Studios in London, and it really came to the front of my mind. Well, actually, I was walking around there with some people that were touring us around, myself, my wife, and my daughter. They were, they were touring the 3 of us around. they were directing our attention to certain things. You know, the fact that Hagrid was played by two people, one person, another person sitting on top of them, and things like that. And what I actually started to understand was that model of what a tour guide does is so applicable for what we do in lessons. Do we actually pause a lesson at a key time and actually say, well, this is that key bit of knowledge that is so important that is going to be linking to other things that are coming forward? So the idea of a tour guide model of learning, I think, is something that's incredibly appropriate and incredibly important for us to consider. How are we directing students' attention by considering what it actually looks like for them when they're looking out at what's around them, but also how are we directing their attention the same way that a tour guide would if they were taking us around the city? So we've gone through motivate, we've gone through attend. Now let's turn to relate. So relate is this idea of where we're taking new information and relating it to our existing knowledge base. I was really lucky that Dawn Ashbolt from Wren School wrote this chapter for me within the book. And so she shows some excellent ideas out of Shimamura's paper, where it really gets stuck into the idea of how relating ideas together is what actually makes them stick within our memory. And the four main ideas that Shimamura wrote about within his paper were the idea of how we can use mnemonics to relate concepts, how mental movies and metaphors and analogies can also help, how schematic representations show these relational links between certain topics, and how we apply the 3 C's rather than just using them to direct attention, but how we apply them to allow information to stick more within our memory. So mnemonics are pretty straightforward. They allow students to remember key facts by linking them together into chunks of knowledge related to things we already know. So quite often when we're teaching students, sometimes there's just a set of facts that we need them to remember, and quite often as a science teacher, I know that comes up often within my curriculum. You know, key things that I just need them to know that are going to be used later on for us to hook future learning on. And therefore mnemonics become a really useful tool at that point. So one of the best ways of trusting mnemonics use is really simple things like Mrs. Nerg, which is used in Key Stage 2 science. I was really lucky to go to primary school and see this in action, where they were using Mrs. Nerg as a way of talking about the 7 life processes of movement, respiration, sensitivity, nutrition, excretion, respiration, and growth. So the idea of a mnemonic being there to allow relational links to take place is so important. It's almost like the foundation upon which other things are going to be hooked. Without that foundation, things won't build upon it. So therefore, it's important for us to consider what mnemonics could we use to allow things that are very clearly in place in the first instance that we're now going to be building on going forward. Shimamura also talks about the idea of mental movies and metaphors and analogies. So when we use visual imagery or metaphors or analogies to help students understand and integrate and reactivate facts, what we're actually doing is using the existing knowledge base that the students actually have to get new ideas across. So I'll lean on science again for an example here. Quite often there's abstract ideas in science that are really difficult for students to be able to visualize in some form or way. And when we're talking about an atom, it's really hard to understand what an atom actually looks like. You know, we only have a model of the atom. You know, we can't actually see it physically with our eyes. We have a model based upon experiments that we've done. But actually, when we're trying to explain that to a student, when we're trying to explain that real microscopic world to a student, it's really difficult to do. So what we can use is visual imagery or metaphors to do that, or analogies to do that. So quite often I've seen teachers use the idea of, say we've got a football stadium, very topical right now, say we've got a football stadium, and you've got a football in the center circle, right in the center of the football pitch. Somebody sitting all the way at row Z, so right at the top, right out of the way in the stands, as far away as they can be. That would be where the electrons, that would be the outside the atom, that's where they would be. The center circle, that football there, that's like the nucleus of the atom, and everything in between is empty space. And that's a great way of representing what the structure of the atom actually is in terms of how much of the atom is actually empty space. And while that won't necessarily be to scale, it's a way of explaining, and it's a way of demonstrating to students that actually the vast majority of an atom is empty space. So ideas like this are really important for us to use when we're trying to make the abstract concrete in a student's mind, for them to actually understand, well, gosh, so much of an atom is empty space. Schematic representations are a pretty straightforward idea, and I know they've been discussed at great length before in the past by people that are much better at explaining the idea than me. But what they do is they clearly demonstrate the links between different areas of knowledge. They show how one idea links to another idea. And the reason why they're so important is they allow students to directly relate areas of knowledge. They can see the chain of events almost taking place. They can see how Newton's laws link to motion. They can see how hierarchy and timelines and sequence of events happen in history. They can see how processes occur in geography related to longshore drift. So all these ideas rely on an idea of a simple step-by-step process where things are linked together, and schematic representations are a great way to show that. And we come back to the 3 C's. So with relates, Shimamura talks about the idea that when we apply the 3 C's, we can actually start to develop links between comparing, contrasting, and categorizing different areas of knowledge. So in Key Stage 2 geography, we can have people compare, contrast, and categorize different habitats around the world, and therefore they can make links between them. They know that there'll be certain features that are the same in Africa and South America because of similar climates. And what this allows students to do is to be able to remember it better. There's a greater link within their memories, what Shimamura was talking about, because of the fact we're relating knowledge together. So that goes through relate, the idea of mnemonics, the idea of mental movies, metaphors, analogies, schematic representations, and applying the 3 C's. Now let's move on to generate. So generate is about when we generate information to improve our memory of this. It really goes through this idea of think it, say it, teach it. So elaborative interrogation is a key part of this process. So what he says is that the key to long-lasting memories is that reactivation and elaboration of that key information that's been delivered to us after we've initially learned it. So going through that process of telling others what you know, that elaborative process, engaging with elaborative interrogation, he says, is really important for us to actually be able to remember things. And he leans on this idea of the generation effect and the production effect. The idea of generating learning through using cues, but also the production effect about using that information very, very quickly once we've generated it to allow us to remember it for a longer period of time. He also talks about the idea of how the 3 C's can be used for a self-testing process to allow us to therefore potentially even predict new information and new knowledge. And he says that doing this over a spaced period of time strengthens the links between areas of knowledge, and therefore we generate stronger links within our memory. So by telling others what we know through elaboration, we engage in a process of elaborative interrogation that expresses our thoughts and understanding. What that means is there's stronger links between different areas of our knowledge within our schema for a specific idea. This is one of the things that's frustrated me most about students in my career, that actually, whenever I've spoken to parents at parents' evenings or students at parents' evenings as well, I've always asked, so what do you talk about in terms of science at home, or what do you talk about in terms of your learning at home? And the answer is always nothing. And parents quite often are frustrated about how they can engage with their students at home around the learning process, especially when they get closer to assessments and examinations. So one of the things that's really, really simple is to break this model. Or break this area down. One of the things we can do is just provide students with topics to discuss at home with their parents. And by engaging with that process of elaborative interrogation, by talking about the idea of being asked questions about a specific area, they can actually start to build better links between knowledge bases in their memory, and therefore they'll be able to express themselves better, and that will only lead to better performance. And quite often we see this in subjects like RE, when we get students to justify their thoughts at the end, once they've learned a whole bunch of factual knowledge about an area, at the end of a topic where we try to get them to justify their thoughts, we see the improvements happening within students when we do that. So one of the things that I really picked up on when I read this book, and when I wrote this book and when I read this paper, was actually how much are we getting students to talk about what they know and how they know it, and how are we ensuring that students, when they are talking about specific areas of knowledge, that we know that they've got a good knowledge base to do that upon, but also that we've provided them with a decent set of factual information that's correct, so they're not building on misconceptions when they do this. The generation and production effect was new to me when I came across Shimamura's paper, but it was really interesting when I started to get into it. And actually, it's refined certain areas of my practice, especially around labeling diagrams and using definitions. So the generation and production effect talk about the idea of cues and hints that encourage students to generate a response during the encoding process, and then doing something with that newly acquired knowledge straight away. So Shimamura did some tests where he gave students, he gave some participants in research studies a word, and the word was waste, and it was next to garbage, so the two words are closely related. And within the word waste, he removed two of the letters. He removed the A and the E. And what he was hoping was that the participants would be able to generate the word waste by looking at the fact that garbage was in front of it, or vice versa. He'd remove letters from garbage and hope that they could generate the word garbage. And they could. And people that did that were more likely to remember that word than people that didn't. And he did it with a whole bunch of different words. And it was very clear that actually when there was that idea of having to generate the word as part of the process, the participants remembered it for a longer period of time, but also if they were asked to use that information very soon after generating it, then they remember it for even longer. So some of the ways in which this has refined my own practice as a science teacher, whenever I'm going through labeling diagrams in terms of parts of the body, say in year 7 in science, most students will be aware of specific parts of the body or systems within the body already, but they won't necessarily be able to label them correctly. So while they'll be aware of terms like the cardiovascular system and terms such as that, I'd guide them to a point by providing cues where they could actually generate the phrase cardiovascular, and then I'd get them to label that on a diagram very quickly. And that's already started to see, I'm already starting to see the benefits of that in terms of my own teaching. And again, we can do similar things with food and nutrition over labeling diagrams and questioning students on definitions for cooking devices or for utensils. When he talks about the 3 C's in Generate, he talks about the idea of self-testing, and actually how self-testing yourself or testing yourself in specific areas of knowledge could have this idea of actually generating links between different areas that you might not have seen before. And therefore, if we use the 3 C's as a model for self-testing, we can actually start to develop a deeper understanding of subject areas. So the idea of potentially using a knowledge dump and then starting to link knowledge dumps between two different areas, so like a brain dump of ancient Egypt and ancient Greece, and then compare the two of those by engaging with the 3 C's, we can start to generate ideas about how these ancient civilizations are similar. And the final part of Generate that he mentioned was the idea of space practice. And I know we've talked about space, many people have talked about space practice before, the idea of testing at intervals to suppress this idea of Ebbinghaus's forgetting curve. So why this is important in terms of generating information is that it allows you to start making links between certain areas. If you space certain topics out, so say you've taught in computer science this idea of designing algorithms before, and you know it's going to be important in terms of software development, then space your practice out with testing students or reviewing the work with students and designing algorithms on the approach to when you get to software development. So that by the time you get to software development, students will see that link and they'll be able to generate the link between those two areas. So that's Generate. So telling others what you know through elaboration, the generation effect, the production effect, self-testing using the 3 C's, and this whole idea of space practice. So now let's move on to evaluate, which is evaluating one's proficiency in learning. So Joe, I'm just going to double check that you're ready to take over. Do you wish for me to click through for you?
Yes, please.
No problem.
So, go on. Sorry. So as Nim said, the 5th and final principle of the MARGE model is evaluate. So evaluation comes at the end of the learning cycle and it requires students to metacognitively reflect on their learning. The questions that students need to really consider at this point is, how do I know whether I have learned? So thinking metacognitively is really tricky, and actually as teachers we need to teach them that. So this chapter looks at how do we teach our pupils to think metacognitively and to reflect on their learning more accurately. Often students overestimate their abilities and their knowledge, which leads them to incorrectly conclude they have learned, when it's likely that they haven't. Throughout this chapter, we discuss a series of ideas that allow students to apply metacognitive and self-regulation strategies to ensure they can effectively check what they think they know and whether it is that they actually do know. And it will also help them to identify what is not known and therefore needs to be recovered. So the three areas that we cover in the chapter are interleaving topics, so mixing related topics while learning to test the robustness of what's been learned, preventing the illusion of knowledge, which is my personal favorite, and which is engaging with processes to prevent or to prevent over or underestimating what they think they know, and flashcards, how they can be created and how they can be used to ensure knowledge is retained. So next slide, please. So interleaving topics. Sorry, I am not doing this off the top of my head. I'm using my notes, so I'm not as confident as Nim. So when we're creating medium and long-term schemes of learning, it's not unusual for us to cover one topic and then move on to the next, and then on to the next, and so on. And that approach is called blocking or massing, and it's traditionally how schools have approached delivery of content, and certainly is how I have traditionally delivered content in my subject, which is business. However, if we go from a blocking strategy to an interleaved strategy, we create opportunities for topics to be revisited over time, which is much more effective for long-term learning. So in the classroom, we can actually plan to deliver content in an interleaved way. For example, an example I came across it was in a study on vocabulary strategies, was that problem-based subjects could interleave or mix questions upon homework and on quizzes with previous materials, which also links in with spacing, which is what obviously we've talked about before, but Nim was looking at it just a few slides ago. So an example here that we've just put up is that in economics, what we could do at A level is, for example, I could set a task where students have to complete supply and demand diagrams, as well as, so let's say we just covered supply and demand. So we could do a supply and demand diagram, but at the same time within the same activity, some income elasticity calculations and some price elasticity calculations. Next slide, please. So the illusion of knowing is, like I said, it's one of my favorite areas because it's just so common in pupils that they feel that they know something and therefore they don't feel the need to relearn it and revisit it. So something that I used to do, when on reflection, it was a terrible thing to do, was I would get my pupils when preparing for exams to rag rate the specification based on what they thought they were really secure in terms of their knowledge, what they thought they were a bit shaky on, and then what they thought they definitely needed to revisit. And the problem with that is that unless they really are accurate in their evaluation of what they think, of what they know, then they can't do that accurately. So a better way of doing that, you can see in the inaction box at the bottom there. So what you could do is you could do, I mean, this chapter talks a lot about quizzing and using quizzing to check knowledge and to check understanding. So for example, you could do a pre-topic quiz, or you could do a during topic quiz, or you could do post-topic quizzes through self-quizzing or through cumulative quizzing, however you choose to do it. And then once the quizzing has been done, then you could get them to rag rate their understanding, because that would give them a more accurate reflection of what it is that they know based on how well they've just done on those quizzes. Next slide, please. Just call me Chris Whitty. And then lastly, flashcards. And flashcards are things that we use so much. I mean, my daughters have just finished their A-levels and their GCSEs, and it's a standard revision technique. They both used them. I think the problem with flashcards is that they have to be used properly to be effective, and so that's where we can step in as teachers. So Shimamura explains, I knew I was going to say it wrong. I put so much pressure on myself. Get it right. That flashcards are really a really good way of allowing pupils to make those connections between cued or paired associations, like key terms or definitions, and certainly really useful in MFL. And also they can be used to set up learning, so how one thing leads to another. So at the bottom there, we've just put like an example could be in music. If you had, because you use pictures, but you can also use words. So you could have pictures of instruments on one side of the flashcard, and on the other side you could have, say, the name of the instrument plus the instrument family, and they could be placed picture side up, and pupils could be checking then, do they know the instrument and do they know the instrument family? Also within the chapter, we look at ways that we can encourage pupils to not just make them effectively, but to use them effectively as well. So I won't give too much away because I know that we're kind of running towards the end now. Next slide, please. So,
right, so
yeah.
Thank you very much, Joe. And what Joe didn't say at the start of it is that I was really lucky to have Joe write that chapter for me. And she did an amazing job of really getting into the sticky stuff, as she said, about what evaluation actually is in terms of a metacognitive process, which is one of the hardest things to do. So as Joe said, we're coming towards the end of our time. So we'll talk about how this whole idea of a whole brain process talks into developing learning aids. So while we talked about flashcards briefly there as part of an evaluation process, it also ties in with this whole idea of how we use knowledge organizers, and how do we actually use knowledge organizers in terms of linked to the self-testing process like Joe was talking about, but also in terms of use with the 3 C's. Shimamura also mentions this idea of SQ3R, which is the survey, question, read, recite, review process when we're reading a text, and how that can be used to actually ensure that students have a deep level of learning when they're actually reading through text. And when we're thinking about MARGE, the links to that area are really, really clear. So when we're surveying a text, we're looking for what actually are we paying attention to, and when we're questioning parts of text, we're engaging with this idea of elaboration. And when we're reading it, we're trying to relate facts together. When we're reciting it, again, that whole idea of elaborative interrogation is taking place, or elaboration is taking place there. And when we're reviewing it, we're going through that process of evaluation. So you can see how all these ideas link to MARGE. Cornell note-taking, when you have that big picture question at the top of your Cornell note-taking sheet, that's a motivational factor there potentially. When you have your key ideas down the side, that's driving students' attention. When you've got your areas linked together in bullet points, that's your relates taking place within there. So all of these ideas, all these different learning aids are linked to MARGE in some way. The idea of the Feynman technique, which is where we present in a certain way, where we try to summarize what we're saying into key points in a real clear way, and then we're constantly looking for how our explanation is either filling knowledge gaps or has gaps within the explanation, again, has very, very close links to the idea of MARGE. So just to summarize, and I know a few people have asked for a slide before, and it will be available on Twitter. When we talk about MARGE, we talk about the ideas of motivate, attend, relate, generate, and evaluate. Within MARGE, we define learning as this ability to acquire knowledge through our sensory experiences. And therefore, we do that through top-down processing, where prior knowledge guides the sensory information that we're actually being processed. And we do this by applying the 3 C's of compare, contrast, and categorize. When we're trying to motivate students to action, we're asking big picture questions, we're harnessing storytelling, we're asking static questions, we're exploring new places and new ideas. When we're directing students' attention, we could define explicit learning goals, where we could chunk knowledge in specific areas. We could use the 3 C's of compare, contrast, and categorize, but also take students on a guided tour of the content. When we're relating new information to what students already know within a knowledge base, we can use mnemonics to relate concepts together, or even provide that initial knowledge base if it's not there in the first place. We can use mental movies, metaphors, or analogies to help us relate knowledge to what students already know. We can use schematic representations, and yet again apply these 3 C's to help students relate new knowledge to what they already know. When we're generating new information to improve what we know, we can get students to tell others what they know through elaboration. We can use the generation and production effects to actually break down this process of what do these words actually mean, and how are we going to get students to remember them better, and potentially make links between words and specific and specific areas and their definitions, and get them to use those words very, very quickly. Self-testing using the 3 C's of compare, contrast, and categorize can also lead to this idea of generating new information, making predictive jumps within our knowledge. But also applying space practice allows us to make very clear links between specific ideas that are closely related within the curriculum. When we're evaluating, as Joe talked about, we're talking about evaluating how well we know knowledge. We talked about how we can interleave topics to do that. And as Joe said, again, it's one of my favorite ideas as well, this whole idea of the illusion of knowing. How well do we think we know something? Do we know something as well as we think we do? And therefore, how can we go through a process of preventing that? And how we can use flashcards as a real great tool to actually help that process of evaluating what we know. MARGE is not a checklist, but it's a framework for learning, and therefore we can apply it to learning aids. We can apply it to knowledge organizers, to other techniques that we use to help us gain a better understanding of how students learn. And that takes us to the end of the presentation, at which point I will stop sharing and shut up for a while.
Set about making sure that isn't the case, because I think it's a really valuable piece of work.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think that, to be fair, I think MARGE is ripe for lethal mutations because it appears like a checklist at the end of the day. You know, we motivate the students, we make them pay attention, you know, we relate stuff to what they know, then we start getting to generate them.
Because it's an acronym, it's not a model, it's not a process. Yes. Yeah.
Exactly. So people think, right, it's a checklist, let's just move through it. And I think that's the problem with it. However, if we treat it as a framework to consider, well, you know, if this isn't working, have I thought about this? Have I thought about this? I feel it works better in that way. In terms of the 3 C's, I think so much of the 3 C's, especially around expert teachers, is based around subject knowledge. Because where expert teachers have deep subject knowledge, what they can actually do is to start to make real clear links and do those 3 things themselves, actually compare, contrast, and categorize things themselves. If they don't have that subject knowledge, or they have very surface level subject knowledge, they struggle to do those things at speed. And therefore they'll say, well, this is similar to this, and this is similar to this, when actually it's not as similar as I think it is. And when I was going through the inaction part of this, I asked so many questions of so many teachers because I was so worried that actually, is my subject knowledge up to scratch on these different, you can imagine how worried I was, and I know you know me quite well, Kat, you can imagine how worried I was about the English parts of these, especially with me knowing so many English teachers. I was thinking, gosh, these English inaction ones that I've got here, I've got to make sure it actually makes sense, especially when it came around to the 3 C's. Because where the subject knowledge isn't as strong as a teacher, they will potentially make mistakes. And when those mistakes happen with the student, we know it can actually lead to these misconceptions that become incredibly hard to unpick. Joe, I don't know if you've got anything else that you want to add to that?
No, I completely agree. I think it is right for lethal mutations because there's so, like, even as you go through each chapter, essentially it's just like these are the things that you could do. So it would be really easy to jump in and just start picking things out and trying to do all of them. So even if, even if you're thinking about, say, just the evaluate chapter, you might have somebody going, well, I'm going to start using flashcards and I'm going to start using interleaving and not doing any of them particularly, I don't want to say well, because that's just so patronizing, but not really kind of implementing them really properly and not thinking about how they're done. Yeah, that is a worry. Or even, things like, team leaders taking it and imposing it on their teams, or are people going to start doing kind of CPD on this kind of thing and delivering it and doing it in a way that is not embedded and not useful? I think that's kind of the worry.
And it's such a body of work. I think what I really enjoyed, and then I will shut up, Nimish, is that the intricacies in which you explored each particular part, but so subject specific that you could really, as a novice coming to this paper for the first time, coming to the acronym for the first time, spend a great deal of thinking time on just one aspect of that acronym, and that would be a far more valuable way in, like Joe says. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. If we take, attention and like really start to break apart attention, how are we actually doing everything that we do with attention in incredible detail? And actually, it's not about saying like, oh, I'm going to do this and this and this to make sure I get students paying attention. It's about thinking, well, actually, I do this already. Why does it work? Why is it making a difference? And how can I therefore refine it, rather than actually like all of a sudden doing a whole bunch of new things?
Yeah, and it aligns really nicely, the attention part, with cognitive load theory. And if you've got a really, grounded understanding in cognitive load theory, then you can understand how that attention is shifted, and start to move away from kind of extraneous load, and talking about it in regards to in quite simplistic terms, and actually start thinking about, okay, well, once we've managed cognitive load, then what? Then where do we want to pause over to ensure that we're taking a really firm handle over a student's journey through the curriculum. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Kat. I think we've got some questions in the chat.
Yeah, so Christina said, really interesting how the MARGE model seems to pull together lots of different aspects of expert teaching. The idea of using the 3 C's to self-test, said it feels like a fascinating extension of the idea that when we are learning, we remember better if the knowledge is linked together. So when testing or revising, if you use the 3 C's as you've suggested, you're reinforcing the links and creating new links that reinforce the memory. So somebody said, well, this is an interesting question. Have you started to use this to develop other teachers' practice in your school?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because I think that is by Christina, that question. I was just reading it as you were saying. Yeah, and it's interesting because when we're talking to staff, I think it's really important to consider where staff are at specific points in their journey of where they understand learning and their models of learning. And I don't think you can just lift something like this and put it in place within a school. I think Christina's put schools there because she knows I work across a trust. So the whole idea is that I know that I can go to certain schools that, as Kat mentioned, have an understanding of cognitive load theory, can start to see the links. Well, this affects this deeper understanding that I have of how students learn, and therefore this dovetails in with my practice bit by bit. I don't think you can go to a school and say within a half an hour session, "Hi guys, this is MARGE, off you go." I think the joy of MARGE really comes from breaking each of the sections down and taking it down to a level of subject specificity, where we're saying, well, here are some ideas. What does this look like in your subjects? Come and tell me, or come and discuss. And actually, the whole idea of, when he breaks down motivation into the ideas that he links with motivation in terms of aesthetic questions and such, that can be applied in pretty much in a wide variety of subjects. I mean, when someone said to me, well, think about aesthetic questions in science, first thing I said, well, right, yeah, science, aesthetics, yeah, what? But no, of course, the whole idea of aesthetics fits into science in a huge way. And I think that's what needs to happen with a model like MARGE. We can't just lift it and just put it in a whole bunch. We need to stagger our way through it and think, well, actually, if we're considering using aesthetic questions, if we're considering the process of how we motivate students through the curriculum and how we deliver the curriculum, what does this look like in your subject, and how does it look different to other subjects? And understanding the difference is just as important as understanding what it looks like in your own. Joe, I don't know if you got anything to add to that.
No, I'm really sorry, I wasn't listening.
I have that effect on people.
I was looking at Twitter. I'm so sorry.
I was listening.
Oh.
Yeah, I suppose because
I agree completely.
Because there's quite, like I say, it is quite meaty, isn't it? And I think, yeah, like I say,
I think the compendium analogy is quite a good one. I suppose that's my other question. Sorry to interrupt, Lynn, just hogging. Is if you are a novice teacher coming to this for the first time, you pick this up in your NQT year, what would be your advice as to where they should shift their attention to first? Where do you think is kind of a manageable aspect of this piece of work?
In terms of MARGE, where would you start with it? And
Because
and I don't like breaking it apart almost, because it does feel, yeah, it does feel weird when it is broken apart. But actually, I understand why people would want to break it apart, and I've just discussed that actually breaking it apart is the way I'd probably go about delivering it. But actually, I think relate is one of the key chapters within the book, and Dawn, who wrote the chapter for relate, really gets into the nitty-gritty of how the learning process is so important in terms of having that factual knowledge that's so important, and how things are layered on top of that, almost like a cake. And I'm using an analogy and metaphors and ideas like that when that chapter talks about it. And that's why I think it's such an important thing to do, especially really early in your career, where you're trying to understand, well, actually, students need this before they can have that, before they can have that. And then when you've got an understanding of that, it's almost like going back and thinking, well, actually, how am I going to make sure that they've got that through ideas such as motivate and attend? And then how am I going to check that's actually understood through ideas like generate and evaluate?
Thank you.
So I can't make that into a word in that order, unfortunately.
The cake analogy works.
Yes.
Yeah, I suppose exactly, because
I like food.
If you're, I mean,
Yeah,
if you're a new teacher, you'll go through that process of the relate yourself anyway, aren't you? Because you're actually at that point, you will be quite still novice with your own, like you're saying, it's your own knowledge base that you've got. So just looking like back at your motivate and stuff.
But at the same time, I think go on.
No, you go.
But at the same time, I think it's quite useful, because I think that actually, if I, as a novice teacher, had this piece of work put in front of me to mull over, maybe not necessarily do anything with, but to mull over, I think it would have avoided some of the lethal mutations that I've definitely been guilty of along the way. And I think just to echo Christina, I think it does draw together a lot of key cognitive science that we now know and aware of, that now is thankfully part of the early careers framework and part of the national professional qualifications, that actually I think it's a really good think piece to start those conversations, to bring it all together. So
yeah, it's the thing I really like about MARGE is that wide breadth of what it's talking about, and actually it doesn't feel inaccessible when you talk about it. You know, people understand, well, students have to be motivated not through saying, oh great, I'm going to give you £10 if you get those 10 questions done. They have to be motivated about the content that they're actually learning. And actually it makes sense that we have to direct their attention to the key facts that we want them to know, the key bits of information, the pertinent stuff. And it makes sense that it's got a link to what they know already. And actually it makes sense that you've got to give them a go at actually generating some and making some predictive links with this. And it also makes sense that you've got to evaluate that at the end of the process. So the whole idea is it's odd because it's very common sense. And what it does is it provides that first entry point into, well, what's the deeper neuroscience, what's the deeper cognitive science saying about each of these, and therefore how can we start digging a bit below the surface on this and going further. And I could refer to it as a bit of a gateway drug, and it is. I got very much into the whole idea of motivation and attention that I wasn't so into before when I came across this paper. And now, even through my leadership work and my communication work, I think really carefully about, well, how is MARGE affecting that? How am I communicating an idea to staff am I directing their attention to that sort of things? Am I asking them how they feel about certain stuff when I'm doing it? And it's really shifted a lot of my own thought process about how I deliver CPD, how I actually operate as a leader, and how I work with teams. Because if this is how people learn, and we know that people within a school learn every single day, no matter what stage, not just students, but staff as well, then we need to engage with these processes, even if just at a surface level to begin with, for us to understand how we're going to shift people's thinking. And I'm not saying it's a silver bullet or anything like that to help us better understand the learning process, but it provides that framework for you to consider, well, when something isn't going right, what could it be?
I think as well that it's in terms of ECT and novice teachers, it's not overwhelming. It's really, in terms of the size of the book, you could read this in an hour. And if you think about things like Teach Like a Champion, which are huge, aren't they? The physical size of the book and the amount of information. I think it is kind of an accessible way of kind of starting to think about the cognitive and starting to think about how that can, because obviously even the paper isn't inaccessible in that way. The really nice thing about this book is it provides that kind of, well, this is how you could use it in the classroom, and these are the things that you could do. So I think it is a really nice little step into cognitive.
Definitely. And I remember when I did my first draft of it, and it was about like 200 odd pages long. And then I was thinking about, well, actually, what would this feel like for, I remember me and Joe like voice noted back and forth these sort of things. And we're thinking, well, how much detail are we going into this? And we're thinking, well, what is our target audience for? And I think where me and Joe landed with it is we wanted it to be for your NQT. I think the phrase I used to yourself was, how would an NQT feel about picking this up? And actually, if you're providing, an idea and you're giving 3 like really snappy bullet pointed examples, great, that's exactly what they need. Like, what would it look like in this? What would it look like in this? What would it look like in this? Where it would really make it difficult for them is, when I'm talking about why an area is so important, if I give one real detailed example and then another one and then another one, and it's almost like, right, here's that detailed example. I've got it now. And then they read another example, and then they're off track. It's almost like if you imagine it like a train, it's almost like, the first wheels come off the rail almost, and they're like, so that they're on track, they know exactly what they're doing, and then an example just knocked them slightly because they haven't understood it in the same way as another one. And the problem with that is that it means, and I know I'm almost getting to the points of essentialism and those sort of ideas where, keep it really trim, what we're talking about, and just focus on the core facts. And while that wasn't an approach with it in many ways, what was an approach was actually, how am I going to make this get to a point where it literally is bang, 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 here's some ideas, bang, 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 here's some ideas, to allow it to be what it actually is, which is a step in rather than a massive piece. And when Joe says, you could read it in an hour or two, that's exactly what it is. The paper you could read in an hour easily. I mean, Shimamura's paper is 50 pages, if I remember correctly, and you can just batter through it in an hour really easily, and it just gets your brain going. And when I did read it, for the next week, it's all I thought about in everything that I did, in every lesson I walked into, in every lesson I taught, in every conversation I had about learning. And it genuinely shifted my thought process from actually, how much of the time are we thinking about when we think about learning, and when we're reflecting on learning, just what a student is actually doing rather than what's going on in their head, and getting them to check about what's going on in their head. And it's such a great way to have those conversations without getting so deep.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, sorry, I've got a small child as well coming in at the moment. HE, Mum is just here. You can take whatever you want. Yeah, I'm just sort of thinking, I think that when you are starting out and you are training, it'd just be a great guide, wouldn't it? Because when you are really having to think deeply about, okay, so I'm teaching this, what does this actually look like? What do I want the students to sort of learn? How are we gonna, when you're back in those early days and you're really thinking step by step, sort of really kind of granular how your lesson's made up. I think it's a brilliant one for that. I also think actually, and I think getting on to sort of Joe's the sort of metacognitive side of it, that actually for teachers, it's quite a good tool for us to, when we maybe think we know a little bit more about cognitive load and some of this science and what we actually do. So just as, we're saying that students, they have that tendency, don't they? They often think they'll say if they're to predict what they'll get in a test, they'll say 70 and then they'll get 63% because they have no appreciation of what it is they know and they don't know. I think with this model the way it is as well, it's quite a good guide for us as the sort of teaching profession of actually, do you know what, maybe you should do a little bit of metacognition on yourself of how much of these things you do know, and then hopefully maybe avoid some of these lethal mutations that we've already touched on might occur.
The really interesting, and Joe mentioned how much he loved the whole part of the illusion of knowing. And again, that's something that me and Joe bounce backwards and forwards so much, that the whole idea of thinking you know so much about something, or thinking you're at a certain point with a certain concept or certain idea, and not actually having a proper evidence base for thinking that, or not actually seeing the full breadth of what you've actually got to get, is so crucial to this whole process. Because as Shimamura says, students will not engage in a process any further, or engage in a concept any further if they know it. So we've got to get to a point where we can get students to evaluate their learning effectively. And when we think about the best students we've ever taught, that's what they do. Those that perform incredibly well are very, very good at making accurate evaluations about what they know and what they don't know, and then going and doing something about what they don't know. Things like Dunning-Kruger have been put out there, and I know it's currently being debated about whether it's statistical noise or not. But that whole idea that sits behind it of actually, when you know a bit about something, you think you know a lot about it, I genuinely believe is a thing. We're teachers, we teach students day to day, and actually we see it quite often that students think they've got it at the first stab, or when they've got that surface level understanding of it, and they don't see the bit of the iceberg that sits underneath the water. They just see what sits on the top of it. Damn, we should have used that analogy in the book, Joe. but
perhaps perhaps that's the true value of this book, is actually encouraging us as practitioners to really take a good look at how honest we're being about what we don't know. And actually it makes for a really useful think piece, I think, rather than focusing on what do I implement first, which one of these 5 things am I going to go into my classroom tomorrow, and actually which one of those 5 things are you going to really think about and evaluate from your classroom practice tomorrow. And I think that's where it really pulls some weight, I think, because it's like you say, you could apply a lot of this to so many aspects of organizational leadership, and I think it just encourages us to slow down and be a little bit more mindful. I think if you go in with, especially like the attention and the generate, you're encouraging people to speak far more tentatively about what's being presented to you and how you're going to interpret that, and the implications, what you're going to do with that. It allows us to speak far less in absolutes of this is the way it is, this is what good teaching looks like, this is what I know to be true. Actually, the more you know, the less you know to be true. And I think Marge really encourages you to do that.
100%, definitely.
I think the whole evaluation thing was really interesting, and I think probably we don't, for students and for teachers, we don't spend enough time on evaluation, do we? And especially in like the GCSE and A-level, there's so much content to get through. We don't evaluate, we're always on to the next thing. And I think we do that a lot as teachers as well, with like learning the next thing and wanting to find out the next thing. And we do need to spend longer on the evaluation thing, like we've just been saying.
I think it's finding that alignment as we start talking more and more about a knowledge-driven curriculum. It's really it's really quite straightforward to pick up a knowledge-rich curriculum and start talking about instruction and absolutes and a right and a wrong. And I think for maybe some less experienced teachers, that's quite difficult to work out. Okay, well, how do I encourage pupils to think critically and evaluate and have thoughts for themselves or interpretations for themselves, instead of just telling them the stuff and then we'll move on. And I think, like you say, Jay, it really allows us to go back to those conversations, but within the framework of a knowledge-rich curriculum still, I think.
I think that the key with the evaluate section, which Joe talks about, is the whole idea of us modeling this. With students, we need to model it as teachers, what this process actually is. But we also need to therefore reflect on our own reflections of evaluation. So, and Sam Twiston did a great piece of this, like quite a few years ago, where she talked about what new teachers do and what new teachers evaluate themselves on when they're thinking about their teaching. I think the phrase of a task manager, task manager, curriculum deliverer, and skills and concepts builder. And the whole idea she talked about was actually, what does a teacher reflect on when they're trying to engage in an evaluation? So she spoke about when they're task managers, they reflect on, the student got all 10 questions right. great, great lesson. They got all 10 questions right. They completed the worksheet, brilliant. That's what I wanted to do. Or I got through all the lesson objectives that I wanted to cover this lesson. I completed the lesson, great, had a great lesson because of that. But what neither of those things are doing is actually focusing on learning. And actually, when students evaluate themselves, what are they trying to? I completed all the questions, brilliant, yay, and that's not what that's not what actually learning is about. And actually, where we need to shift students to is the same place that we need to shift ourselves to as teachers. And when we reflect on our practice, what we should be reflecting on is actually as a concept that the students currently knew, been built upon in some way. And it's so interesting. I had a conversation with a maths teacher the other day about a lesson that they were planning on delivering, and actually it was a brilliant lesson because what they were delivering on was the idea of compound interest. And they quickly unpicked that the students didn't have a good understanding of percentages, and therefore they thought, right, can't do compound interest without percentages. Go back, teach percentages. If I don't deliver the curriculum lesson on compound interest, doesn't matter. They've got percentages. I can come back to compound interest next lesson. And that was the point of reflection that took place there. But how many of our students are going through a process of revision, or going through using flashcards, or going through using knowledge organizer, whatever it might be, and thinking, right, I've got to get through this because I've got to do that next, and I've got to do that next, rather than effectively evaluating step by step, do I get this concept, and therefore where is it going to next?
Nim, do you think,
a bit of a random, but something
no, that's fine.
About.
Just on that, do you think then in some sense we need to, there's room for changing some of the terminology I think we use in things. So I'm just thinking that, when we are training, whenever you do lesson observations, you always talk about reflecting, don't you? So we almost like sideline and force people into kind of, you go, oh, and you would say that you'd be like, oh, well, I'm really pleased because the work I planned, the students have completed it all, or like you say, I've got through all my lesson objectives. And really we should be changing our mindset that we're asking the questions of like evaluating your lesson and stuff, evaluating, so that we can go through this process and kind of move away from this idea of like, don't know, reflection, as I suppose, because is it really getting us anything?
I think we're really in a really good place right now. If you think about like the new ECT framework and the MPQs, and new teachers who are going to be coming into the profession will be coming in with this kind of knowledge base, rather than we're all talking from the experience of where we were told that you evaluated learning by if they could answer the plenary. So I think it's probably experienced teachers that need to get their head around it more than new teachers, who I'm really jealous of, not only because of their age, but also because they're getting this really good quality kind of evidence-based approach to teaching delivered to them. So
I think it pokes around far more at the how and the why. I think that and this isn't a criticism of the early careers framework, it's just what tends to happen as a result of any learning, isn't it, is that we all focus on the what, on what the content is that you want to take away, but actually you're only, as a novice teacher, you're only going to have so much experience of implementing that and reflecting on it. That's why obviously the mentoring process will be so valuable, but at the same time it's just a year, it's just 2 years, it's just 3 years, and actually the discussions that come out of, okay, how will this look in a classroom, but more importantly, like Nimish said, why am I doing this, and have I actually explicitly had that conversation with students as to why I'm putting a knowledge organizer in front of them, and why we're looking at it, every single lesson, and what the value is of that, or whatever it is that we're doing. How obvious is it as to the reason, the rationale that sits behind that process that we're carrying out with students? And actually that's really valuable, having those explicit conversations. And I think that this shifts us to the how and the why a little bit more, I think, which is going to be really useful to early careers teachers.
Completely agree. And I think, it's that whole idea of thinking about these sort of models of learning as more of a framework rather than that checklist that I keep going back to. And I mentioned it right towards at the start of the book and at the end of the book, actually, and say that this isn't something that we just work through step by step and tick off, but actually it's like when you're considering a task that you're doing, or, I lean back on the idea of a task, which I just said, we should be thinking about learning as in using tasks. But if we've got a task and we're using a task, thinking about the how and the why makes us reflect on, well, how is it delivering that concept, and why is it so good at delivering that concept compared to so many other, and why am I using this technique to do it? Because actually then we're checking that actually we're trying to be efficient with what we're doing rather than just doing something because that's what we've always done, which again I think is something that this really made me think about. I've always delivered like specific areas of science in a specific way, and I've never understood why until I picked this up and really started to unpick it. You know, why does my model of teaching Newton's third law always seem to land, and the students that I teach, I then pick up again at A level, always seem to remember it? Why do the students that I teach electricity have in year 7 and then in year 9 and then again in year 11, why do they have a better understanding of it at A level than students that are from other teachers? And when I unpicked it, when I read this, it unpicked a lot of it for me. It made me understand how I actually got them to think about things in a specific way or in a different way, which made them more interested in those areas. I mean, Louise will know that actually electricity is like the most hated area of physics. You know, students absolutely hate it, they detest it completely. Even students that do physics at A level and go off to do it at university detest electricity, but students that I taught didn't for some reason. And when I started to unpick this, I understood why, because they were more motivated to learn more about it because they knew more about it. They had that base level understanding, which meant that they were interested about it in a different way and therefore could relate what I was talking about to what they already knew. And it just fell into place when I read Marge. A lot of that just fell straight into place when I read it.
I so much appreciate being with you guys, but my goodness, you don't half fill my head with loads of stuff and then leave me thinking, oh my goodness, like, yeah. So have you got the original paper, Neil?
I wasn't expecting this conversation to end up with ECT. I wasn't expecting this conversation to go down the route of the early career teachers. And the
Yes, sorry, that was a bit precarious, wasn't it, of me?
No, but actually, it's something I have been thinking about. You know, like how do we get people that are novice teachers, people that are new to the profession, into these ideas without completely swamping them? You know, we've all been on a journey and got to this point over a period of time. You know, it took me about 10 years to get anywhere near this, even though I came across cognitive science back in 2005 when I was at university. It took me 10 years into my learning, into my teaching career to actually start to actually think, oh yeah, that can affect how I can teach. And now we're saying, well, we want this in year 1. So how are we going to do it to make it actually useful? So, sorry, Louise, I think I cut you off.
No, I didn't. I think somebody has said, how do we develop other teachers with this then?
It's an interesting one. So it's all about, for me, the model is all about the bit at the end of it, evaluating the process of learning, and actually, you know, when learning isn't happening as we're expected to happen, how can everything else that we know about the learning process help that? So if we're trying to help develop other teachers, it's about getting them to think about the learning process, reflect on what they're doing and think, well, actually, if I'm doing this, why am I doing this, and how can I do it better? Because doing something better is developing.
It's that thing, isn't it, like you said, and it's that sort of looking at why are you currently doing something a certain way, and actually, are you just doing that because it's the way it's always been done? And then looking at this, well, actually, is there an alternative way that I could do this? And I think the beauty is that as well, we are all in the classroom, aren't we? So we can actually, it's a case that you can actually actively participate in this, because you can take these things into your classroom and actually see them work with your students. So, oh, right.
Definitely.
I think that's it.
Thank you, Nimish. That was really useful.
No problem. I think that is it. No, thank you very much, everyone. No, it was really nice for you guys to ask me here today, and I really enjoyed talking about this. And it's been, and what it's been about is it's been about the journey of everything that I've almost that I've learned through the conversations I've had on Twitter, through listening to other people, and talking to yourselves about so much about the learning process, and then reflecting on what I know about it through reading the paper at MARGE, and just looking at everything that I've learned through that lens. And it's been great to really unpick that in a huge level of detail.